Woman Up is a podcast talking to self-identifying women and non-binary artists, creatives, art critics, feminist historians, activists, and more. This series was conceived by Desperate Artwives founder Amy Dignam in collaboration with me, Susan Merrick. Desperate Artwives is a platform established in 2010 for women artists who are also mothers and carers. Amy's work focuses on domestic disorder, unsteady identity, power, and dysfunction. And I'm an artist interested in feminism, language, power, and access. In this platform, we share conversations with women that inspire us and our work, whilst producing a long-form content of resources for other people to access. Hello and welcome to Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Artwives. I'm Susan Merrick, and today I'm talking with artist Felicity Allen. Felicity is a British artist and writer who makes paintings, books, and films, often collaboratively. Her current work is mainly focused on two durational projects. For one, she's developing her concept of the Disoeuvre as a feminist alternative to conventional ideas of an artist's oeuvre. For the other, she produces series of dialogic portraits. She's just completed her most recent dialogic portraits project, including her film Figure to Ground, a site losing its system, with the cross-disciplinary research project People Like You, Contemporary Figures of Personalisation. For most of her working life, Felicity has been involved in informal and higher education and, having run the education department at Tate Britain, published a series of articles on gallery education. And she edited the Whitechapel MIT Documents of Contemporary of Art book, Education, published in 2012. Hello and welcome, Felicity.
Hi, I don't know, did you catch the van just going past? There's a lot of occasional noise. Anyway, I hope we're okay.
No, don't worry. I'm sure we'll get lots because we're at home and it's the nature of recording at home.
Okay.
So welcome, Felicity. I would like to jump straight in because I'm really excited to hear about and understand more about your ongoing work, the Disoeuvre. So could you please tell me about it, where it's come from, how it started? Yes, please.
The van keeps going. I just realised I meant to... here we are. I've got it. Sometimes I write these, what I call false poems, because I'm not a poet, so I can't write poems, but this is a false one. And I'm just going to read a bit of it because I think it's a quick way of introducing the concept of the Disoeuvre, if that's okay. So, the Disoeuvre, a definition. A neologism meaning an oeuvre, not easily recognised as one. She says, okay, oeuvre, a rethink's overdue. This Disoeuvre, unpicking, analytical and anarchic, teenage, perhaps old age, do I deserve a recognition? She's wresting the French word oeuvre into the English dominant present, dissing it, switching it with the French désoeuvré, out of work, idle, with nothing to do. Creating a Disoeuvre is not a progressive route to creating an oeuvre, but vice versa. Cradling a life's work, a labour of beings, process and product, made through and with people and institutions, and the not yet identified as art, revealing the not yet identified as artists, the not yet identified as good. The Disoeuvre accommodates shifts of direction, language or discipline, an artist sustaining a practice despite and in response to contingency, whether structural, political or fluke. She builds on feminist and Black critiques of exclusive conventions to dismantle the elevated oeuvre. She's backing off judgment, holding paradox, sloughing off the binary. To uncover a Disoeuvre, track the trails of a marginalized artist's labor across the domestic and her employment. Think duration when you think maintenance. Think commitment when you think thought. Burrow. Think again, again, and again, and again. Name it. The Disoeuvre recognize art's otherwise orphans, unaligned, unbranded, disowned in a fog of expanded field.
Wow.
Does that help?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Okay. I think the otherwise orphans for me is, I do feel otherwised in a punning sense. And I think that's I think that's a lot of us probably feel that, and particularly as we get older. There's something about embracing, for me at the moment, the idea of wisdom being associated with age in a way that's a benign aspect. There are many ways in which age can be good and bad, obviously. And one of the ways in which it can be good is if you really think about how you can use your experience and the knowledge that you've gained and the dislocation that one experiences as an older person from the now, because one is constantly marginalized, peripheralized in a way, because one of the things that you become aware of, I'm very aware of, is how informed I am all the time by what I learned when I was 21, rather than as well as what's going on now. And it means that I endlessly tell boring anecdotes of when I was a child and so on. But actually, if you can use that to think about the now, it can be quite interesting.
Yeah. Have you always felt marginalized or on the periphery, do you think, as a woman artist?
I think that's what's the difference between feeling and being there in that question? I think even when I've been, I think it's very common for everybody with any form of success, you never own that, you never feel an ownership of that success. It never feels tangible, real, permanent or anything. So you always have that sense of being outside your own success. So I have had moments when I haven't been marginalized, I would say, but I never felt that I wasn't marginalized. And you know, certainly if you get a job running a department at Tate Britain, how can you possibly call yourself marginalized? You know, it's nonsense. But in some sense, as an artist, I absolutely was, but it was also a choice. I mean, yes, totally marginalized in terms of the ways in which I'd internalized the exclusions and the marginalization that was common to women of my generation. You know, one of the things that I do talk about is, and it's very real memory of, I had an important exhibition, solo exhibition, that I'd worked very hard for in 1986. But it happened to be at the same time as Helen Chadwick had a solo important exhibition. Hers was at the ICA, mine was at the Air Gallery. The Air Gallery was a decent place to show. The ICA was better. And the ICA was much more geared to promotions, you know, to PR and so on. And Helen was better known than I was. And I think it would be fair to say she was a better artist. But because she, you know, she was a landmark, really important artist for women of my generation and younger. But because in those days, it was absolutely normal that only one woman could be recognized, I completely stepped back when those two shows were running concurrently. And I did not do what I needed to do to promote it and hustle and all the rest of it. So nobody knows that I had that show. It doesn't exist. And it's a real, that was, I'm not saying it's only my fault, but I'm talking about the ways in which I internalized marginalization and the dominant patriarchal systems from that period.
I imagine that was not all just internalized structures as well. I imagine that was probably quite a public feeling too.
I think people generally did it.
I was just earlier having a look at the film that you were a part of, the documentary in the 80s called, I did my digging, called artist lives, not artist wives.
It's, what's it called? Lives of Artists, not Wives of Artists.
That's the one, yeah.
It was meant to be a sort of new Vasari, basically.
Yeah, that was it. So I haven't watched it all yet, but I think that's it's another good way to start in thinking. You know, you were obviously already thinking about, hang on a minute, I exist here as an artist and as a woman, and as were your contemporaries, and having to challenge some of the status quo. So has that fed into? It's obviously feeding into your Disoeuvre, but is that fed into your career pathway, the types of education, the types of practice that you have had and encouraged through the institutions that you've worked with?
I guess.
I guess I'm asking, is you being a feminist a grounding, you know, the foundations of your work and who you are as an artist?
I think so. I mean, actually, I read in this, there's a catalogue which I'm very pleased to be included in, which has just come out for the Ikon exhibition at the moment. What's it called? A Very Special Place. And I'm in the introductory essay where all the artists who are in the show are written about or mentioned, you know. I get, if you like, positioned as one of the feminist artists. And I think it's entirely deserved. You know, I have never made any bones about it, but also I have always felt very ambivalent, not about feminism, but about being positioned as a feminist artist, because I think that one of the things, I did a PhD a few years ago, which is where I started to really develop this concept of the Disoeuvre. And when I was doing that, I realized that when I was reading all the sort of feminist art historians, I realized that they were reading absolutely everything, including all the people who weren't writing necessarily from a feminist perspective, but who believed they were incorporating a feminist perspective. Whereas the people who believed they were incorporating it weren't reading the feminist literature. They never referenced the feminist literature. They were not reading it, and that's women and men. So once you get positioned as feminist, it means that you actually are likely not to be included in something more general. Mm-hmm. And also I'm one of 4 sisters, and my sisters are all older than me, and my family fell apart when I was a girl, and they became very important in my care. And so for me, being kind of positioned within women has always been problematic. Like, it's been very comfortable, but at the same time I think, oh God, surely I can grow up and leave home now kind of feeling, you know. So there's that kind of ambivalence that I have about it.
Yeah, interesting. Going back to the Disoeuvre.
Yeah.
Has that come at a much later stage in your career, or is it something that you've been playing with in the earlier practice that you had?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think that's a really good question, and I don't think that. I think basically what happened was I had 10 years in which I had to stop studio practice because I was the full-time breadwinner for my children. There was a crisis when my children were little, and I became the sole parent and the breadwinner and all that. And so I thought, okay, this is, you know, at that time I was freelance and doing lots of different sorts of work, including, and actually when I look back, I'm always impressed at how much I was exhibiting my work. I thought it was a fallow period, but I eventually thought there was too much of a crisis, and I thought, okay, I have got to go and get a full-time job, which I'd never had before. I'd had 25 years of practicing as an artist where I'd only ever worked part-time. And so I went, and first of all, I worked at the Hayward, and then I went to Tate Britain. And so there was a decade in which I wasn't painting. And I was writing, I was continuing to write, but I wasn't practicing through a studio. But early on, when I went to Tate Britain, I went on a leadership course because I was a leader. And I listened to these old blokes telling you how to become a leader. And I thought, well, this is weird, because this is exactly what I already know through having been a studio-based artist for years. And it was really about self-reflection, but also thinking about a practice which needs to get out and needs to be communicated, and so on and so forth. And basically, I then started thinking, okay, I will think about my office, my work, my place of work as my studio equivalent. So I started to think about it like that. And I couldn't find my way into that, but I was sort of mucking about with it. I had a very full-on job. But in the course of that work, I started to do a project with people in Syria. This was in 2004. And I started to set this project up with the British Council and from Tate. And initially it was people in Syria, and then it became people in Jordan as well. And basically that became like my project. So I was running this department, and I was doing a lot of changing things in the department to get the programs really good and really working together, and I was making sure that we changed the color of the department is one of the main things that I was doing. And so I started working on the Syrian project, and as I did it, I realized that I was pulling in all the different sorts of knowledge that I'd worked with through the 80s and 90s, when I had been doing community teaching, I'd been doing adult education, I'd taught in higher education. I had worked with arts and disability organizations. I had a range of, I'd done residencies in very different institutions and so on. So I felt very uncut for a while during that period. For a short time, the only work that I was doing, the only paid work that I was doing, was either commissions, public art commissions, or teaching in art schools. And I did find that a bit difficult, because I'd actually found the work working with people with disabilities, it was like coming home, because I'd grown up with people with disabilities. And so there was a way in which I found the art world. I always found the art world in its kind of most kind of recherche moments to art world and to cut off. And so in that period in the 2000s, when I was working at Tate, I sort of realized that in this Syrian project, I was bringing together all this knowledge and combining it. And I was using things like observational drawing and observational writing and so on and so forth in a group with other people. And I was, yeah, that's enough about that. Anyway, that's when I started to think, oh, this is actually my practice. I'm bringing my practice into my work here. And actually what happened when I left Tate in 2010, I ended up continuing to make a work with my Syrian contact. And it has had to be, I can't tell you about it because I have to protect her she's still living in Damascus, so I have to protect her identity. So I can't tell you about that particular work, but we spent years working on it. It has been exhibited under a different name and so on. But I think the continuity of taking it, as it were, beyond the institution, for me kind of was an important kind of acknowledgement of the fact that within that institution, I was making a project, not everything I did, but a project that was definitely my own practice. So from that, I started to think about the Disoeuvre. So in a sense, you could say, yes, I was always working with it, but I only conceptualized it in hindsight, really, or as part of its practice. And then after that, I was invited to go to the Getty after I left Tate. And I spent some time writing stuff and thinking about it more, and then eventually did the PhD, from which and there are more things coming out of it. So we've got, I'm in a writing group, which is brilliant, really fantastic writing group. And some of them are working with me to do, working with me, we're working together to do a session at the next Art Historians Conference to do with the Disoeuvre. And I'm also working with Althea Greenan and Janice Cheddy as well at the Women's Art Library. We're working together to do a series of kind of roundtable discussions to get more ideas about it. Because I have this problem now, which is that I have named it, and I want to be credited, thank you, for coming up with naming something that loads of people recognize, so it's not just me, but I also have to let it go into the world, and other people are already interpreting it, and I'm thinking, hold on a minute, that's not what I meant. And I have to kind of, I have to come to terms with that, which is going to be,
that's going to be really hard, isn't it?
Well, it's I just have to make sure that I'm doing the stuff, making the work that I need to make out of it. And then if other people, whatever happens, basically.
Yeah. So reading what I was able to read online about the Disoeuvre, it instantly struck me as something that a lot of women artists and artist parents who have more responsibility of the children in general, whether they're male or female, anyone who's got other responsibilities really and has to work in that fragmented way, I guess, could really, really relate to. And to have, so actually it's incredibly important that you've named it and and are able to give voice to that and theorize around it in this space that's taken decades to come to, but it's incredibly important. So I'm excited to see where you take it, and also where other people, I guess, start to take it as well.
I think one of the things that I'm really keen to do is this is where this is my problem with it, if you like. I don't want the sense of anything I do is art because I'm an artist. I just don't believe in that, and I think it would devalue the concept of the Disoeuvre. So I think one has to know that one is working intentionally. That is the thing, and that one is working. That one has to have a practice in which one has the highest standards, and then one can put that practice with the highest standards into different situations. But if you don't carry those highest standards with you into those different situations, it's not a practice. I think that's the way I'm thinking. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's very clear. Yeah.
I mean, it's like when you're an artist and you go and do work with kids. There is no value this is a big deal for me. I mean, I used to do this a lot. I don't so much anymore, but there is no value in going and working with kids if you just use the materials that they use normally. You have to give them proper professional art materials because it is transformative. It's not just about you having this knowledge, it's about them having access to the materials.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like that. It's like that. Or you have to know what your practice is first.
Yeah.
And I started after I first left college, this is back in 1978, before your grandmother was born, probably.
No.
I arrived in London, and I started off by getting jobs in what was called community arts. And after a bit, I realized that the organizations, that I didn't believe in what they were doing, and I didn't believe in what I was doing, and I was really bad at it because I hadn't actually developed my practice sufficiently well to be able to work from that position of strength, which is where it comes back to all that leadership nonsense.
Yeah, that's really clear. Thank you, Felicity. What else did I want to ask? I wanted to ask you about your focus on the maternal subject, where that came from and how that's influenced your practice.
Oh gosh, I only realized recently how consistently I've been banging on about maternity my whole life. Basically, my mum died when I was a child, and I live with her still very strongly. And she affects a lot of the people who lived with her and the people who she died before they were born. But the sense of her is very, very powerful in our extended family. And so from a young age, I found another false poem I wrote when I was 21 or something recently, and it summed it up completely brilliantly. Actually, I was rather impressed. But I've reworked this thing over and over again, which is basically living with someone who's haunting you, and you don't want them to go away. You wish they were more present, so you could leave them alone. Actually, and so I started working on stuff to do with her absence and her presence. And then I was also the generation of women, I really think this is true actually, we were the first generation who managed to avoid, generation, when I say that, I mean literally 5-year group. It was a marginal, but we were the first lot of people who managed to have kind of, as it were, the women's movement was already happening as we were going through college. I got very involved with it. Most people I know didn't get involved with it, but they just rode along with it, kind of thing. But we had, by the time we were sort of 16, we may well have already been on the pill. And so we had a sense of controlling our biological destiny, in a sense. And we decided we were not going to get married and have babies as soon as we finished our degrees, which is what our big sisters had all done, and if they were lucky enough to go to university. And so there was a whole load of us, my friends and I, who hadn't, in quotes, settled down. Also, we thought we were going to run the revolution through living differently and having different sorts of sexual relationships and stuff. And so, we'd read our Simone de Beauvoir, basically, and we're trying to reenact it. And in our early 30s, a lot of us suddenly thought, shit, you know, and in those days, IVF wasn't really much of a thing and so on. And we just all thought, oh my God, do I want to be living collectively with other women? Do I really want to be living with a bloke? And do I want to have children and so on and so forth? And there was this kind of, it's just like a hum. And we weren't necessarily saying it out loud, but it was like a hormonal hum going on. Like, oh, crikey, we better get on with it. And that's when I made the photographs, one of which is in the Ikon exhibition at the moment, of big photographs of babies. And they were actually, the model was someone who was my friend's baby, because it was before I'd had children. So I then started doing stuff to do with that. What next? And I was making, I was also making these still life, big still life paintings of sort of hanging pendulous vegetables, sort of thinking about Cotan and Zurbarán and the Spanish still life painters, but thinking about what it was how I was thinking also about those kind of questions about the feminine, you know, the female body and how we are, you know, embody our knowledge and blah, 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 what it feels like to be female. And then once I had children, I actually started painting all these cooling towers, big cooling towers. And they were really maternal. I saw them, actually I don't know whether you've ever been on the M62, but there's there used to be fantastic collections of cooling towers.
I'm from near Hull, so yeah, I've travelled it a lot.
So you know those collections of, yeah. I always used to see them as like girls in a club dancing around their handbags kind of thing. Yeah. And they've just got this fantastic sort of, I did have accepted an idea in the 90s for projecting like Venus de Milo kind of, you know, torsos onto them, which would have been great, but it didn't come off, sadly. But I was very struck by the ways in which they look like images of corsets, or they look like female torsos, basically. Yeah. And ballooning skirts. And so I did a series of them. And I would say that they, for me, you know, it was coincidental. It wasn't conscious. I fell in love with cooling towers. I was a new mother, you know. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying they were maternal, but I eventually thought, yeah, there might be a bit of a link there.
My parents used to call them cloud makers.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's yeah, I think there are lots of aesthetic links that we maybe see later on, don't we? If not at the time.
Yeah. But then when I went into the writing, so basically when I had children, I found I had to write because of the trauma of having lost my mum, blah, 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 blah. I found I absolutely had to write because there was so much going on through the experience of having small children. And so I started to write, and eventually when I eventually had to take on the full-time job, I thought, okay, well, what I'm going to do is, I've started this writing. I'd always written, but I'd done it much more consistently, I suppose. And I'd started to think, okay, I'm not going to be able to paint, but what I will do is I'll practice writing. So I'm not writing for publication. I am writing to get it better. So I'm just doing what I normally do, but giving a bit more, working at it harder. And so I did that. And then when I was working at the Hayward, I started to get involved with the man who is now my husband, who is a poet. And he said to me, well, you're a writer. And I said, don't be silly. And he said, you write, therefore you are a writer. And I had actually written since I was 12. I'd written diaries since I was 12. Not daily, but. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if I could be. And I knew about Dorothy Wordsworth. I knew about all these women writers who had been behind the male writers, you know. But I couldn't see myself doing it. And then he invited me to write something together with him, which I did. And it's a little chapbook called Telegraph Cottage. And in that, my writing, we decided, it was just after we got married, in fact, and we decided that we were going to write about love. And so my writing in that book is all about basically the kind of romantic, fictional ideas of love that my mum basically, you know, medicated us with, that completely sort of affected my relationships and demolished my, didn't do me great service, let's say, in my relationships as I was growing up. And but I obviously still have a great yearning for this stuff because it's the literature of my childhood and so on. So I was writing about, I was writing about my mother and the maternal influence, if you like, and maternal love and what it does and how it this kind of fantasy of romantic love that we live with that's produced largely by women. Anyway, so
and Hollywood, I would suggest.
Yeah. Sorry, of course I forgot about Hollywood.
Oh, thank you so much, Felicity. I think I've covered everything that I would like to and that Amy would want me to. Is there anything else you would like to talk about before we finish?
I think there's one thing, that the question that you have kindly not asked me, which is how did I become an artist? I think there is something that I would like to say in response to that. And that is that because of coming from a very sort of broken up background, there are obviously all sorts of things that impact from that, including, low self-esteem, blah, 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 blah. And there's kind of, things that deeply affect one's life. But the thing that I would want to say is that it's noticeable to me that the artists who had a relatively secure, and I don't believe any childhood is secure, but had a relatively straightforward, progressive childhood experience of school and then college, particularly if they went to a London college, had a completely different level of support and confidence and knowledge than people like me, who were floating all over the place, not without any guidance, basically. And obviously I did a degree in English and Fine Art at Exeter in the 70s, and the only lecturers we had were male, and some of them were predatory and some of them weren't, but you didn't know which ones. So because of vulnerabilities I already experienced, it meant that I absolutely had to steer clear from them because I didn't want to be near anybody who was predatory. And that had a big impact in terms of sort of my confidence and my knowledge, and also my learning about how to negotiate education and how to negotiate institutions. And I think that I'm using it very subjectively, but I hear, when I listen to other people's podcasts, and they seem to have a sort of security and a continuity, I just think, you don't know how lucky you are, having that. It's such a different experience. Sometimes you see people's photos on Instagram they put up from when they were children, and they're wearing smart clothes. And I think, bloody hell, you come from a completely different background from me, and they're my friends, whatever. But it's a very, very different experience, I think. And so getting to how do you become an artist becomes a much more complicated question, because it isn't straightforward. You go to university, you do your degree, you drop out for a year, you go back, you force yourself to go back over and over again. That's how you become an artist.
Thank you, Felicity. Yeah, I was just going to say that I totally agree and can really empathise. I didn't have an insecure childhood, but I had a very insecure teenage world, just because of where I lived. And, my parents were a lot older. Education was secondary, really. It was lucky that we were having one. They didn't really have much of one. I'm slightly older than I look, I think. I'm in my early 40s. So I was growing up in Hull in the 80s and 90s. And I had
teaching there. I was teaching in the 80s. I was teaching at the art school in Hull.
Well, I would have had no idea, because I get frustrated. I only became an artist in my 30s, right. Because I didn't even know it was something you could do prior to that. There was a lot going on in Hull actually around that time, and I feel frustrated that I had no idea, and that our teachers would have never taken us to see anything or do anything. And I'm quite passionate about access, so it's been really good to get to know your work more and your writing more.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really, really appreciate it. And I can't believe how nice it is to talk to you.
Yay. Oh, thank you.
How generous you are. And how much, to have watched that film, it's amazing. Huge thanks. I'm so honoured to be part of this series. It's such a great series. And honestly, it's just it's a lovely thing. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Flick. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. You've been listening to Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Artwives in collaboration with me, Susan Merrick, and in association with the Women's Arts Library at Goldsmiths.